This is a tutorial on the request for repair form, CAR form RR, and the seller response and buyer reply to request for repair, CAR form RRRR, or as I like to call it, the quadruple R, because saying R 4 times sounds silly. All right, so this is used in the course of a transaction during the inspection period when the buyer has gotten their reports back from the termite company and from the property inspector, and they want the seller to make a corrective action or offer credit or a sales price reduction or something like that. And this acts very much like a counteroffer, how you're proposing terms and the other party's countering those terms back. So I'll try to make this as straightforward and as simple as possible. We start by putting the date that we're preparing this form here. And by default, this is part of the purchase agreement. Then we put the date of the purchase agreement here. We put the property address, the names of the parties, and then we jump right into the request. Now, this has a handy little reminder. The seller has no obligation to respond to the request, and the seller can just ignore it. And the buyer's leverage is if they really want the repairs done, they can say, well, do it or else I cancel. That's the buyer's leverage. That's why you do this before contingencies are removed. All right. Now, buyer requests that the seller, let me jump over here, take the specified action, okay? Action being the operative word. Why? Because the big mistake made here when you're requesting repairs is I see agents just write a problem. They make a statement about a problem in prose. They don't ask for the seller to do something. They say something like leaking or kitchen faucet is leaking. Or they'll say bedroom screen torn. Okay, you're making a statement, so what? The point is that you need to have a verb. You need to have the seller carry out a specified action. What are you tasking the seller to do? So in my examples, we have verbs. Replace, fix. Now, this is where you're putting line items of what you want the seller to do. If they don't fit here, make a separate list on a Word document, on a piece of paper, whatever. Date it, put that date here, check the box, and you could leave this blank and just have a very long laundry list of different repairs that you want done. But I'm just giving you a couple examples here. So I put replace broken window in laundry room, and then I put where you can find more information or where it's noted on the inspection report. There are two things that you want to keep in mind. Number one, you want to task the seller with an action. Replace, fix, seal, repair, things like that. And then you want to be as specific as possible what we're talking about. Window in the laundry room. And you can find that problem item mentioned in the inspection report under number 41. Same idea here. Fix the leaking faucet in the master bathroom. So now you know which bathroom it's in, what's going on. You want them to fix it. You don't just write leaking faucet. And then if that was in the inspection report, put the inspection report item number 25. And that's it. You're doing line items just like that. I like to go 1, 2, 3, 4. You could do Roman numerals if you want to get fancy. I mean, the point is just make it easy to read and tell them exactly what you want them to do. Be as clear and specific. You do this. You fix this. Now, down here, we have the termite. Once upon a time, the termite request for repair, which they called wood-destroying organisms, was in the purchase agreement. And the problem was that when the seller would sign a purchase agreement and agree to doing the repairs, they had no idea what they were signing up for. And a termite report would get done, and there might be a $30,000 estimate for repairs. And the buyer will say, all right, seller, now it's time for you to authorize repairs. And the seller would say, wait, hold on, I had no idea it would be $30,000. And the buyer could say, well, you signed the purchase agreement, you're obligated, you're stuck, sorry. So rather than have the seller sign a blank check, now it's pushed over to the request for repairs. And we have a termite report already. We know what the work's going to cost and what needs to be done. So you're going to check this box and say, hey, seller, have section 1 termite work completed. And you'll know what it is on this report prepared by this company, and this is the date of the report. Now, Section 2, just to be clear on what the distinction is between Section 1 and Section 2. Section 1 is active infestation. These are problem areas that are happening right now. You're having termites that have infested, or you're having wood rot right now. Section 2 is potential for it in the future. This is a potential. This needs to be repaired or treated. It's not a problem now. It will be in the future. 99% of the time, Section 1 repairs are the only thing that are getting done in escrow. That's it. So I'm just writing this out, what's typically done, rather than, I'm telling you why Section 2 is here, but 99% of the time, you're going to ignore that. This is going to happen during the before close of escrow. So B, we're done with B. That's termite. That's your request for termite repairs. C, buyer requests seller credit buyer a dollar amount. Now, another mistake agents make, they put a dollar amount here and they have their to-do list up here. And they're thinking, okay, well, the seller can choose either do this or give us money. Well, there's no or. It's not 1A or B or C. This is a request for all of the following, everything. So if you put money here as a seller credit, you're saying, I want the seller to replace or repair or do whatever here, carry out these measures, and I want the seller to credit me money on top of that. If you need to figure out, so before you draft this form, you need to decide what you're asking for. There's no or here. So either get on the phone with the listing agent and hash out what the seller's willing to do, or have a conversation with your client, your buyer client, and say, listen, do you want a credit or do you want work done? You got to choose now, because we have to decide before we draft the form. Same thing here with a modification of the purchase price. Instead of a seller credit on C, D just says you're asking for the price to be reduced. Now, side note, if you're a finance buyer, if the buyer is obtaining a mortgage, this is a bad idea. Almost always. I have a whole separate video about it, but unless you're a cash buyer, don't even think about getting a price reduction. It's a terrible idea. Get a credit instead. Either way, you have to decide, which one of these are you doing? And if you are asking for this in addition, then you're going to fill out both. If you want this done plus $1,000 for something else, then write $1,000 here on up here on the seller credit. So you know what each of these is for, and that they all combine ultimately. This isn't one or the other, not multiple choice. Line 2 here, you're going to put which inspections and reports are referenced. The seller is entitled to a copy of these reports per the RPA, per the contract. You'll check the box and just mention, which reports you have to furnish the seller. FHA and VA borrowers, they have requirements from the lender. You can put that here. And for example, maybe FHA is requiring something to be done, like a stove to be installed, something I'm just thinking randomly that might be something they'd ask for. You'd put that in here, and you're explaining why this is a lender requirement. This isn't just the buyer's preference. It must be done or else the lender won't offer financing. And you're agreeing that if the seller agrees, you'll remove the certain contingencies. And often, so you can do one or the other. You can remove just inspection contingencies, or you can remove everything that's in a CR. Now, a lot of times a buyer will send a CR form with all contingencies removed, or the inspection contingency. I should say investigation, because it's now encompasses a bunch of different things. But as a whole, the investigation contingency, a lot of times people don't even do anything here. You can just leave it as it is by default. That's fine. That's what I'd recommend. But if you really want to if you want to dangle a carrot, you can say, hey, check this box, send a CR removing all contingencies, and send that with your request for repairs. If not, just leave Section 4 alone. Expiration, just like in an offer, you want this reviewed by a certain time. And by default, it's a third day at a certain time. And this is just verbiage. The buyer can withdraw it if they want the request for repairs. That's it. Buyer signs it. We're done. Buyer has made the request. sends it to the seller. Now the seller gets this form, and again, they do not have to respond to this form. They're not contractually obligated to even acknowledge its existence. They can totally ignore it if they want. Seller can agree to everything, and we're done. That would be great, right? And then the seller signs, and we're all done. Or the seller does a partial agreement to some terms and then creates an exception. For example, hey, I will do let's see here. Let me go down. Okay, so since it's all, you can say, here's it's implying you'll do termite, you'll do everything here, but you won't replace the broken window. So you just go down here and you just check this box and write accept replace broken window. That's it. You're just putting what you're not going to do. And that's basically it. So if the seller doesn't want to negotiate what's going on here and instead wants to do make a radical change, let's say, and counter something totally different. For example, no seller credit was requested up here. No seller credit was requested. Instead, there was just a to-do list. But let's say the seller does want to offer credit instead. Well, the seller can go down here, check this box, and then counter it with this quadruple R form. And that's almost always what is going to be done. Now, sometimes you'll see that the seller is going to, this is a silly provision right here, by the way. Ignore number 3. It's this AEA form is just doesn't, it's a pointless form. It can be accomplished by an addendum. They're almost never ever used, and I'm telling you this as someone that looks at hundreds of transactions every single year. So ignore number 3. Number 4 is if the seller rejects it, the seller probably won't even respond. So you don't see this very often. Usually it's all partial, or the seller is going to counter with a quadruple R. Now, the seller is going to sign this and return it, just like you would with a counteroffer 1. And then, I should mention down here, if the seller does a partial up here, the buyer could look at this and just say, you know what, I'm fine with that. And then the buyer could agree to the partial. Like how we gave the example, the seller will do everything but replace the broken window in the laundry room. Well, maybe the buyer says, okay, fine, I'm fine with that. Well, the buyer could accept it right here. Or the buyer could say, no, I reject that. And then the buyer checks this box and does a whole new RR number 2, a brand new request for repair. So that way it keeps it going. It's like sending a counteroffer number 2. And then the buyer's going to sign based on whatever they decide to do here. Now, let's say the seller did a quadruple R. They checked this box, and this is the seller. It's akin to a SCO, seller counteroffer. Now the seller is going to fill this out, transaction information up here. They're going to reference the request for repair number 1, the date, and then they're going to say, so it's unlikely they're going to put this here because they would have just done the partial acceptance on before. Instead, the seller is likely going to do so here's what I often see. Either a credit here, or they check the box other and they create a separate list. That's what's fairly common. That's what a seller is likely to do to warrant the quadruple R form. And then the seller is sending it back. This is a counteroffer. So basically, you can look at this as the request for repairs is a buyer counteroffer number 1, seller counteroffer number 1 here on the quadruple R, and then they send it back. Now, when the buyer gets this quadruple R, the buyer can choose to accept it, or they can reject it and then do a new request for repair, very similar to what you saw here on the RR1. If the buyer rejects whatever the seller's counter is, basically the seller is going to, without making this too complicated, the seller can counter, and they can, depending on to what extent the seller wants to counter, the seller can counter right here on the bottom half of the RR. Okay? And if it's too radical of a counter, it warrants a quadruple R. Now the buyer can get that quadruple R and they can accept or reject it. Now if the buyer rejects it, it basically ends it, And now the whole thing starts over with an RR number 2. And that's where the buyer comes back. And you can see buyer withdraws request for repair number 1, basically saying, hey, I counter I'm eliminating my original counteroffer. My BCO1 I'm eliminating it. And instead I'm creating a whole new, we're starting over from scratch. Okay, seller, we tried to hash it out. I send you an RR, you sent me a quadruple R. It didn't work. Let's start over. I get an idea of where you're at. You get an idea where I'm at. I think let's just clean it up. We do an RR number 2, and that's where you put it here, and then you start the process over again. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I hope this makes sense, but if you look at it like counteroffers and you follow the fact that there's a place on the RR for the other party to respond, and there's a place for the buyer to respond on the seller's response, the quadruple R, then you'll see it's just basically counteroffers that take place with a special section in the bottom for the other party to respond. Again, if you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.